right, so from here, I think I'm going to turn it over to Sarah O'Leary and Bill Halfpenny from DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development. And they're going to share with us about the roles of DHCD, the board, and the Local Tenant Organization.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Today we'll be discussing the role of DHCD, the role of LHA boards and executive directors, and the role of LTOs in interacting with the LHA. As a disclaimer, the presentation is intended for educational purposes only and does not represent a formal legal opinion or regulation by the department. And as Sarah already said, if everyone can just make sure their computer or phone is on mute, that'll help make sure the presentation goes smoothly. Bill?
Hi, everyone. My name's Bill Halfpenny. I'm counsel for the department. And in that role, I work primarily with the Division of Public Housing. So along with Sarah, I'm going to be presenting the training today. And then Sarah, question for you, would it be easier for me to share the PowerPoint or were you planning on doing that? How do you want to do it?
You're welcome to do it, Bill. And then you can flip through your slides at your own pace.
Sure.
Yeah.
So there's the PowerPoint. Can everyone see that?
Yep, you're all set.
Okay, great. And I'm going to turn it back to Sarah to get us started. Sarah O'Leary.
Oh, I did this one, Bill.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so then I introduced myself, Sarah introduced herself. In addition to us, we have two other colleagues from DHCD here. There's Emily Moss, who is the Policy and Programs Manager at DHCD, and there's also Maura Baldiga, who is the Director of Policy, Programs, and Operations at DHCD. So Sarah and I will be going through the presentation together, and then Maura and Emily will be helping answer questions at the end.
So we have 8 topics on our agenda, including background on DHCD and LHAs. We're going to talk about the relationship between DHCD, talk about LHAs and executive directors, and then have a discussion of LTOs and how they interrelate in the program. We're leaving some time for questions at the end. So if you do have a question, if you could put it into the comments rather than interrupt, and then we will try to answer them after the presentation slides are reviewed.
Okay, so we're going to start with answering the question, what is DHCD? So DHCD is the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. It is an agency, a state agency within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and it is located within the larger Executive Office of Housing and Community Development, which you may sometimes hear referred to as EOHED. So I've copy and pasted our mission statement from our website to give you an idea of sort of the broader mission of the agency. We're responsible for the general oversight of housing in Massachusetts, and the mission statement on our website reads, the Department of Housing and Community Development, through its community and business partners, which would include LHAs, provides affordable housing options, financial assistance, and other support to Massachusetts communities. We oversee different types of assistance and funding for consumers, businesses, and nonprofit partners. So as you can see, that's pretty broad, and that covers a ton of different housing and community development programs. So state-aided public housing is just one small piece of that. And then the way that DHCD sort of oversees state-aided public housing is through our Division of Public Housing. So within the executive branch, within DHCD, there is a Division of Public Housing. And we have a graph that Sarah's going to go over to sort of visualize that.
So this infographic shows where DHCD and the Division of Public Housing fall within the administrative structure of the Commonwealth's government. The Governor's Cabinet includes an Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development. DHCD is a department of EOHED. The Division of Public Housing, which is over on the right, is the division at DHCD that administers public housing programs. This division is further divided into the Housing Management and Capital Management Bureaus.
Okay, so we talked about what is DHCD. So now let's talk about what is an LHA board. So all local housing authorities are bodies, corporate and politic, and they are governed and controlled by 5-member LHA boards. So that body, corporate, and politic language comes directly from the State Aided Public Housing statute. And that's basically just a fancy, somewhat annoying legal way of saying that LHAs are their own independent entities. And those entities are controlled by 5-member LHA boards. LHA boards are responsible for sort of the big picture items at LHAs. And they include a number of different responsibilities, some of which I've listed here. So it includes establishing LHA policy in accordance with the law, regulations, and guidance, ensuring all financial and legal obligations of the LHA are met, establishing annual operating and capital budgets, overseeing all aspects of LHA employment, certifying the LHA's annual budget, holding and attending regular meetings, and ensuring the integrity and professionalism of the LHA. So those are certainly not all of the responsibilities of an LHA board, but those are some of the bigger ones just to highlight. And as you can see, what they all have in common, and you're going to hear me say this a lot throughout the presentation, is that they sort of deal with the big picture policy setting items that the LHA undertakes. They're not dealing with the day-to-day operations of the LHA. They're setting the policy, and then we'll discuss later how the executive director is the one who's going to be doing the day-to-day operations of the LHA.
So what is DHCD's relationship with LHAs? As Bill explained, LHAs are independent bodies governed by their board. DHCD's role is not a local management one. DHCD provides funding for LHAs. This funding is allocated by the state legislature as part of the state budget process, and it can be different from one year to the next. As part of the funding process, LHAs sign contracts for financial assistance, sometimes called CFAs, which outline the rules and requirements for LHA spending. DHCD is also the body authorized by state law to provide regulations and guidance for LHAs. So DHCD's authority comes from Mass General Laws, Chapter 121B, and that outlines the roles and responsibilities of DHCD. The regulations that DHCD promulgates to provide guidance and direction to LHAs can be found in the Code of Massachusetts Regulations at 760 CMR. The sections most applicable to LHAs are Section 4, which concerns the general administration of LHAs, Section 5, which addresses eligibility and selection criteria, Section 6, which discusses occupancy standards and tenant participation. Section 8 refers to privacy and confidentiality rules LHAs need to follow. And Section 11 applies to capital issues such as modernization and development. DHCD also guides LHAs in other ways. It issues public housing notices and other sub-regulatory guidance. Public housing notices give LHAs direction on how to do different things or deal with various issues. Some examples of public housing notices would be notices about competitive funding availability, instructions concerning the executive director hiring process, information about the annual and LHA budgeting. And in 2020 and 2021, DHCD issued many PHN notices regarding how LHAs could address public safety and tenant safety issues related to COVID. You can find DHCD's PHNs on the agency's websites. DHCD also does give other kinds of sub-regulatory guidance in various forms. DHCD's team of employees assigned to each LHA can provide guidance in housing program management, facilities maintenance and upkeep, project management and funding and construction advice. Another kind of sub-regulatory guidance would be the AUP, PMR, and annual report requirements for LHAs.
Okay, so I've covered what DHCD is, I've covered what an LHA board is, so now let's spend a little time talking about what an LHA executive director is. So an LHA executive director is responsible for, among other things, hiring LHA staff, executing LHA goals, policy and programs, and overseeing the day-to-day operations of the LHA. So this is what I alluded to earlier, and is the big difference between the LHA board and the LHA executive director. So to illustrate that, let's go over some of the responsibilities of an LHA executive director. These include, among many other things, directing staff to implement federal and state-aided public housing programs in accordance with the law and guidance, ensuring compliance with fair housing and civil rights laws, attending all LHA board meetings, preparing reports at the request of either the LHA board, DHCD, or HUD, preparing operating and capital annual budgets, implementing the management plan that's approved by the board, including overseeing tenant selection, all aspects of employment for staff following the LHA's personnel policy, carrying out the day-to-day activities of the LHA to support and service the needs of residents, and ensuring the maintenance and, as applicable, modernization of public housing units. So as I mentioned, that's certainly not all the responsibilities of an LHA ED, but those are some of the highlights. And to sort of use an example to get at an even clearer picture of the difference between an ED and an LHA board, let's look at one of these. This third from the bottom bullet point talks about how executive directors are responsible for all aspects of employment for staff following the LHA's personnel policy. So I think this is a perfect example of the difference between an LHA board and the executive director. Every LHA should have an LHA personnel policy, which is just a board adopted policy that outlines the way LHAs are going to conduct business with their staff. And it includes requirements for personnel and things like that. All of those personnel policies need to be adopted and approved by the LHA board. And then the executive director is responsible for following that policy. So LHA board puts the policy into place. Executive director is responsible for following the policy and enforcing the policy. So again, that's the big difference between an LHA board and the executive director. LHA board, big picture, setting policy. Executive director, day-to-day operations, enforcing policy.
So what is DHCD's relationship with LHA executive directors? DHCD is required by state law to establish guidelines for hiring LHA executive directors, executive director contracts, and to set executive director salaries in terms of a cap of them. The board still has discretion to assign the executive director's salary following the DHCD salary guidelines. The executive director is an employee of the LHA. They're not an employee of DHCD. And I would take a moment to remind any board members on this call that as an employee of the Housing Authority, the board members need to make sure that they are following the requirements of Massachusetts law for employees, you know, in all respects with regard to paying salary on time, following all the aspects of Massachusetts employment law, providing a safe workplace that meets OSHA requirements and is free from things such as sexual harassment or discrimination. And it's, of course, the executive director's responsibility to make sure that employees under the executive director also are in a workplace compliant with Massachusetts law. So LHA boards, as far as supervising executive directors, LHA boards acting through parliamentary procedure with a majority vote, hire, direct, and supervise the executive director. LHA boards also evaluate the performance of the executive director and, acting with a majority of a quorum, decide whether to offer an executive director a new contract, raise an ED salary in accordance with DHCD salary guidelines, or if necessary, make the decision to dismiss an executive director. LHA boards should not get involved in the LHA's day-to-day operations, as Bill mentioned, be that supervision of staff, tenant selection, or maintenance issues. The board should limit its interaction with the executive director with the day-to-day issues, to setting policy, directing, and supervising the executive director.
So let's spend a little bit of time talking about what local tenant organizations, or LTOs, are. So state aid public housing regulations at 760 CMR 6.092 state the following. LHA shall encourage and assist public housing tenants and adult household members to form resident associations with democratically elected officers to represent residents in the LHA on matters which affects their rights, status, duties, welfare, or other interests. Once formed, a resident association may, but is not required to, submit a written request to the LHA to recognize the association as the official LTO representing a specific group of residents for a 5-year term. So I want to spend some time talking about that last sentence there. You may be wondering, what is the benefit of a resident association being recognized as an official LTO? Well, for that, let's look at my last bullet point here. Once recognized as an official LTO, the LTO is entitled to participate in certain matters at the LHA. These include quarterly meetings with the LHA Executive Director and/or the LHA Board, any matter affecting the rights, status, duties, or welfare of residents of the LTO. They get to participate in the creation of the LHA's annual plan, their modernization programs, and they're also participating in LHA hiring. Regular resident associations that have not been recognized as LTOs are not entitled to participate in those matters. So you can see that there is a benefit to having a resident association recognized as an LTO. Once recognized, the LTO should be holding regular meetings, and it should be governed by written rules or bylaws. And then one other note on that last sentence of the regulation, it states that the LTO needs to represent a specific group of residents. And that means that there cannot be two LTOs that are representing the same group of residents. So you cannot have two LHA-wide LTOs that are supposed to be representing all residents at an LHA. You can't have two LTOs that represent a specific development. An LHA can have multiple LTOs, but those LTOs need to be representing different specific groups of residents. So now let's talk about DHCD's relationship with LTOs. It's actually quite limited. 760 CMR 6.092H says this. If a resident association is dissatisfied with the decision of the LHA concerning the grant or denial of recognition of an LTO, or its decision as to whether to seek department revocation of recognition of an LTO, the association may, within 30 days, request in writing that the department review the LHA's decision. So what does this mean? Let's imagine that you are a member of a resident association. That resident association wants to become the recognized LTO at the LHA. You go through that process and the LHA denies recognition of the LTO. That resident association then has the right to appeal that decision to DHCD. And DHCD will review all the relevant facts, and they will either recognize the resident association as the LTO, or they will uphold the LHA's decision denying recognition of the LTO. Once an LTO has been recognized, only DHCD may revoke the recognition. There's a provision in the state aid public housing regulations that says that an LHA can, I believe the word it uses is petition. An LHA can petition DHCD to revoke recognition of an LTO that has previously recognized. There are specific reasons that can happen, and most of them are related to unethical behavior or illegal behavior. So it's usually an extreme situation, but basically the takeaway is that DHCD's involvement is in either reviewing decisions when an LTO recognition has been denied, or once an LTO is recognized, DHCD may, on the petition of an LHA, revoke the recognition of an LTO. We want to spend just a couple of minutes before we finish up here talking about LHA board members who are also tenants or members of LTOs. This is something that's been brought to our attention quite a bit lately. There are specific rules relating to LHA board members who are tenants or LTO members, specific ethical rules. So we just wanted to quickly discuss those. So from the beginning, all board members, whether or not you are a tenant board member or you are a board member who is an LTO, all board members are subject to the Massachusetts State Ethics Law. And that's Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 268A. And then there are some specific provisions in addition to that law that relate to tenant board members. If you are a tenant board member, you're prohibited from participating in LHA board decisions that affect your own personal interest or financial interest. So you cannot vote on something that comes before the LHA board that would affect your personal or financial interest. If you are an LHA board member who also serves in an LTO, you're prohibited from acting on behalf of the LTO before the LHA. You're prohibited from participating as a board member on any matter that directly involves the LTO, and you're prohibited from contacting the LHA or appearing at any LHA meeting on behalf of the LTO. So that's a lot of information. This can be kind of tricky. So very recently, I think just last week, DHCD released PHN 2022-05 that you can find on our website. That's going to provide even more information than I can give on a single slide here. And what's really helpful is it also provides some examples. So we'll go through an example saying, you know, such and such a board member is voting on such and such an item. Can they or can't they do this? So there are some useful illustrations there. Last thing I'll say about this is that ultimately, the state ethics law is governed by the Massachusetts State Ethics Commission. DHCD doesn't oversee or interpret that law. So you'll see if you look at that PHN that I just mentioned, DHCD says that if you're in a situation where you're really not sure if you should be voting on something or not, you're strongly encouraged to reach out to the State Ethics Commission to get an opinion. Linked in that PHN are a couple of ways to contact the State Ethics Commission. You can either call them or fill out an electronic form online explaining your situation, and they will get back to you with an opinion on whether or not your actions would violate the state ethics law. I think that they say that they'll get back to you within 48 hours. So basically, when you're stuck, you should be contacting the State Ethics Commission. And that concludes the presentation portion of DHCD's portion. And I think we can now open it up to questions.
Thank you,
Sarah,
Bill.
were you going to do your section, Sarah?
Yeah, I just have a couple of slides that I'm going to share, and then we'll open it up for questions. We're getting a lot of really good ones in the chat, so thanks, folks. And yeah, okay. So just quickly, a couple of things from the Mel King training that are relevant to this discussion. I'm going to cue this up here. Just wanted to, let me move this. One of the questions is, well, what if I don't have an LTO? You know, most places I think probably don't. So this is what we refer to as the chain of command for individual residents when you have an issue that you're trying to work through, and this is in our training and we can send it around and it'll be in the slides later. But obviously you're going to submit a work order if it's a maintenance issue. You can talk to your LTO if you have one. Talk to your administrative staff and then your executive director if the problem isn't still being resolved. Then just a reminder, there is a grievance process that you can file a formal grievance against the housing authority, not against another tenant, but against the housing authority if there's a violation of the provisions of your lease. And then if you don't like the decision that the grievance panel or officer gives you, you can sometimes appeal that to the housing authority board. And then sometimes beyond that, you can appeal the decision to DHCD or HUD, depending on whether you're in state or federal housing. So this is just quick reminder on how individual residents can pursue solutions to problems. Secondly, you've heard Bill and Sarah talk about the Local Tenant Organization. An inclusive and action-oriented LTO can have a big impact on addressing problems at the housing authority. Your first big step is to pull the residents together so that you can speak with one voice. We have our spaghetti metaphor from Arlene Carr, who's on the line today. A resident alone is like a single strand of spaghetti that you can kind of easily ignore, but a whole box of spaghetti isn't so easy to break. So we really strongly recommend that informing your LTO, you do a lot of community work in your community to bring people together and hear what folks really care about. And then those will be the issues that you can really focus on in your participation with the housing authority at your quarterly meetings with the ED, at your attendance at board meetings, your comments about the annual plan. And we do, of course, have a training that goes through all of this, and we will be offering another round of that soon. So if you're interested in that, please just let me know. The board, I think that DHCD covered this really well. These are the four of the main areas of the board, the things that the board does. And this is the things that the board doesn't do. I'm not going to go through all of this because you're going to get it in writing. And just a quick note that as the boss of the executive director, a best practice is to conduct a performance review the way any employee receives an annual review to acknowledge strengths and address areas that may need improvement. And then just another sidebar that this is a democracy and that the boards are constituted through democratic procedures. In towns, 3 of them are elected town-wide. We have our new tenant appointment process. And then the 5th member is appointed by the governor. And all of those are open to public involvement in various ways, or resident involvement on the for the tenant seat. And then in cities, 4 out of 5 board members are appointed by the mayor, including 1 resident. So you can always talk to the mayor about their appointees to the board, especially the tenant member. So just a reminder that the board, it's not this intractable thing. It is, there is public process for who sits on the board. Okay, so I think that's everything. Just then a quick plug, 2 weeks from right now, we're going to be talking more in depth about what LTO success stories. So want to make sure that the residents on the line are aware of that opportunity and can join us then. That particular webinar is open to residents.